In the vast emptiness of the Mongolian steppes, where the sky stretches endlessly and the wind carries whispers of ancient spirits, there existed a world that the civilized empires barely understood. This was a land of extremes, where summer suns scorched the grasslands and winter cold could freeze a man in his saddle. Here, survival itself was an art form, and power meant nothing more than the loyalty of warriors willing to die for you. The tribes that wandered these endless plains lived by codes older than memory. The Mongols, the Merkits, the Tatars, the Naimans, the Karaits. Each clan moved with the seasons, following their herds of horses, sheep, and goats across territories as fluid as water. There were no permanent cities, no stone walls, no written histories carved into monuments. Everything that mattered existed in the moment: a good horse, a strong bow, and kinsmen who would not betray you in the night. But betrayal was as common as the grass itself. The steppes were a cauldron of endless warfare, where tribes raided each other for livestock, women, and prestige. A man's wealth was measured in horses, his honor in scars, and his future in the strength of his sons. Blood feuds stretched across generations, each act of violence demanding another in return, creating cycles of revenge that seemed as eternal as the stars above. Into this world of beautiful brutality and endless horizon, the great powers of the age barely cast a glance. To the south, the Jin dynasty ruled northern China with cultured disdain for these barbarians. To the west, the Islamic kingdoms flourished in cities of impossible splendor. To the east, the Tangut Empire of Xia controlled the vital trade routes. All of them saw the Mongol tribes as little more than a nuisance, occasionally useful as mercenaries or trading partners, but ultimately irrelevant to the grand currents of history. The tribal structure itself was both simple and complex. Leadership passed not through bloodline alone, but through demonstrated capability and the consent of warriors. A Khan could rise from nothing if he proved brave, cunning, and generous to his followers. But he could fall just as quickly, abandoned by men who saw weakness or opportunity elsewhere. Loyalty was a transaction, renewed with every season, tested with every hardship. Women in this society held positions that would have shocked the civilized world. They managed households while men were at war, offered counsel in important decisions, and sometimes even rode to battle themselves. Property could pass through female lines, and a strong woman could wield considerable influence over tribal affairs. Yet this relative freedom existed within a framework of harsh pragmatism. Every member of the tribe, regardless of gender, had to contribute to survival. The shamanic traditions that bound these people spoke of Tengri, the eternal blue sky, and of spirits dwelling in every rock, river, and mountain. These beliefs were not written dogmas, but living practices woven into daily life with the same practicality as tending livestock or repairing weapons. The shamans interpreted omens, blessed campaigns, and connected the visible world with the invisible forces that governed fortune and fate. In the year 1162, in a time when tribal warfare had reached a particular fever pitch, a child was born gripping a blood clot in his tiny fist. The shamans saw this as an omen, though whether of glory or doom, none could say for certain. His father, Yesuge, was a minor chieftain of the Borjigin clan, a man of some reputation but limited power in the grand scheme of steppe politics. The child was named Temüjin, after a Tatar chieftain his father had recently captured. It was a warrior's name, carrying the weight of conquest and the memory of enemies defeated. Yet, as the infant drew his first breaths in a felt tent beneath the infinite sky, none could have imagined that this small life would become the storm that would sweep across the world, reshaping empires and redrawing the map of human civilization. The steppes had produced countless warriors, endless cycles of violence and ambition, but they had never produced anyone like Temüjin. Childhood on the steppes was not a time of innocence or protection. From the moment a child could walk, they learned the skills necessary for survival in a world that showed no mercy to the weak. Temüjin's early years followed this harsh pattern, though even by steppe standards, his education in suffering would prove extraordinary. His father Yesugei was a capable warrior who had built a modest following through courage and cunning. He had formed a critical alliance with Togrul, Khan of the powerful Kerite tribe, a bond sealed through the ancient tradition of Anda, sworn brotherhood. This relationship represented security, a network of protection in a world where isolated families could be destroyed overnight. Young Temüjin learned early that alliances were the currency of survival, more valuable than gold or horses. When Temüjin was 9 years old, Yesugei took him on a journey to find a suitable bride among the Olkonu tribe, his mother's people. This was customary. Marriages bound clans together, creating webs of kinship that could weather the storms of tribal politics. They found Berta, a girl of remarkable intelligence and strong spirit, and Yesugei arranged the betrothal. Following tradition, Temüjin would remain with Berta's family for a time, learning their ways and proving his worth as a future son-in-law. On the journey home, Yesugei stopped to share a meal with a group of Tatars. He did not recognize them, but they recognized him, remembered the raids, the deaths, the humiliations he had inflicted upon their clan. The Tatars offered him food and drink, and Yesugei, bound by the steppe code of hospitality, accepted. The poison they mixed into his drink worked slowly, giving him time to reach home but not time to recover. Yesugei died in agony, and with his death, the fragile world of Temüjin's childhood shattered completely. In the brutal mathematics of steppe politics, a dead Khan's family represented only mouths to feed and potential rivals. The tribe that Yesugei had led, the Taichiud, made their calculation quickly. Led by a chieftain named Targutai, they abandoned Yesugei's widow Holan and her children during the spring migration, leaving them to starve in the wilderness. Holan proved herself a woman of extraordinary strength. Gathering her children, Temüjin and his brothers Kasa, Kajun, Temüge, and half-brother Belgute, she led them into the harsh landscape like a she-wolf protecting her cubs. They survived on roots, wild garlic, fish from the rivers, and whatever small game they could catch. The sons of a chieftain became little better than beggars, scratching survival from the unforgiving earth. These years forged something dark and determined in Temüjin's heart. He learned that loyalty was conditional, that strength was the only true security, and that the world respected nothing but power. He also learned practical skills that nobles' sons rarely acquired: how to endure hunger, how to track game, how to survive when everything seemed lost. But survival came with costs that scarred the soul. When tensions over food led to conflict, Temüjin and Kasar killed their half-brother Bekta over a stolen fish and a bird. It was fratricide, a crime that haunted Temüjin even as it demonstrated his willingness to do whatever survival demanded. His mother Holan wept with rage and grief, recognizing the monster that hunger and abandonment were creating in her firstborn son. The Taichiud clan, however, had not forgotten Yesugei's family entirely. They feared that Temüjin, as he grew older and stronger, might seek revenge for their abandonment. When he was approximately 15, they came for him. Warriors raided the small camp, and though Temüjin fled into the forest, they hunted him for days until exhaustion and hunger made him careless. They captured him and placed him in a kangi, a heavy wooden collar that prevented him from feeding himself or lying down comfortably. For months, Temüjin remained a prisoner, dragged from camp to camp, displayed as a warning of what happened to those who challenged the established order. He was beaten, humiliated, and reduced to an object of contempt. But he watched everything, learning the movements of his captors, noting their habits and weaknesses. He was waiting, not with hope, perhaps, but with the patient calculation of a predator in a trap. His chance came during a feast celebrating the new moon. While his guards drank themselves into stupidity, Temüjin struck one of them with the heavy kangui still locked around his neck, knocking the man unconscious. He fled into the darkness, the wooden collar making him an easy target if discovered, a grotesque silhouette against the night sky. The night that Temüjin escaped with the kangui still locked around his neck should have been his last. Every warrior in the Temüjin camp was searching for him, and the heavy wooden collar made stealth impossible. Yet sometimes fortune favors the desperate, and in the darkness, Temüjin found refuge in a place he would never have expected, with Sorkhan Shira, one of his captor's own men. Sorkhan Shira had watched Temüjin during his captivity and seen something that stirred respect in his warrior's heart. This was not a broken prisoner but a caged predator, and some deep instinct told the older man that this youth represented a force beyond the petty politics of tribal chiefs. He hid Temüjin in a cart full of wool, and when the search grew desperate, he took the extraordinary risk of lying to his own people. When Temüjin finally slipped away into the wilderness, Sorkhan Shira had given him more than freedom. He had given him a lesson about loyalty that transcended tribal boundaries. Making his way back to his family's meager camp, Temüjin found them barely surviving but alive. His mother, Holan, had kept them together through sheer force of will, and now her firstborn had returned, hardened by suffering, into something that might survive the steppe's cruelty. But survival alone was not enough. Temüjin understood that without allies, without warriors, his family would remain vulnerable to every passing threat. His first move demonstrated both courage and calculation. He sought out Togrul, his father's Anda, the Karaite Khan who had sworn brotherhood with Yesugei years before. Presenting himself before the powerful chieftain, Temüjin invoked that ancient bond, asking not for charity but for the recognition of an obligation. Togrul, impressed by the young man's bearing and perhaps moved by memories of his old friend, accepted him under his protection. It was a small beginning, but it was a beginning. Now approaching his 17th year, Temüjin also honored the betrothal his father had arranged. He returned to the Olkonut tribe to claim Berta as his wife. She came to him not as a frightened bride, but as a partner who understood the harsh realities of steppe life. Her father, recognizing that he was giving his daughter to a man with more ambition than resources, provided a dowry that included a rare black sable coat, a garment of such value that it could purchase alliances. Temüjin took that coat and presented it to Togrul, further cementing their relationship. It was a gesture that demonstrated his understanding of steppe politics. Gifts created obligations, and obligations could be more binding than blood. Togrul responded by providing Temüjin with warriors and horses, the fundamental building blocks of power on the steppes. But the respite was brutally short. The Merkits, a powerful tribe nursing their own ancient grievances against Yesugei, learned of Temüjin's marriage. They remembered that Yesugei had once stolen Hoelun, Temüjin's mother, from a Merkit bridegroom. The debt of that humiliation had gone unpaid for nearly 2 decades, and now they saw their opportunity for revenge. In a dawn raid of terrible swiftness, they fell upon Temüjin's camp. The attack came with such speed that Temüjin and his brothers barely escaped with their lives, fleeing into the mountains and leaving everything behind. Everything, including Berta. The Merkits took her, along with Temüjin's half-brother Belgutei's mother, as payment for the bride stolen a generation earlier. It was the steppe code of blood for blood, but for Temüjin it was agony. His wife taken, his honor shattered, his powerlessness exposed for all to see. In that moment of devastating loss, something crystallized in Temüjin that would define his entire life. He would not accept this. He could not. To live as a man who could not protect his wife was to live as no man at all. He sent word to Togrul and also to Jamuka, his childhood friend and Anda, calling in every obligation, every thread of alliance he possessed. The response revealed who he might become. Warriors came to his banner not because he was powerful, but because something in his intensity, his absolute refusal to accept defeat, marked him as a man worth following. The rescue of Berta became Temüjin's first true military campaign. Leading warriors borrowed from his allies, he tracked the Merkits and fell upon them in a raid that demonstrated both his strategic thinking and his capacity for ruthless violence. The Merkits were scattered, their camps burned, and Berta was recovered. She was pregnant, and the child, a son named Yochi, would always carry the shadow of doubt about his paternity, but Temüjin claimed him as his own. This first victory did more than recover his wife. It announced to the steppes that a new player had emerged, one who combined the warrior's courage with a calculating mind, who inspired loyalty and could translate that loyalty into coordinated action. Temüjin was no longer the orphaned son of a minor chieftain. He was becoming something the steppes had not seen in generations, a man who might unite rather than simply survive. The rescue of Berta marked a turning point, but it also planted seeds of future conflict. Temüjin's childhood Anda, Jamuka, had contributed warriors to the campaign, and for a time, the two friends led their followers together, camping side by side, sharing the ancient bond of sworn brotherhood. Yet beneath the surface of this alliance, fundamental differences were already growing, differences that would eventually tear the steppes apart. Jamuka represented the old ways, a brilliant warrior and charismatic leader who believed in the traditional tribal system where power was distributed among many khans, each maintaining their independence. Temüjin was beginning to envision something else entirely, something unprecedented, a unified nation under a single supreme ruler, where loyalty flowed upward to one man who would impose order on the chaos of the steppes. The break came suddenly, as these things often did. During a joint migration, Jamuka made a cryptic comment about camping separately, and Temüjin took this as a signal. That night, he led his followers away under cover of darkness. It was a deliberate severing of their Anda bond, a declaration that their paths had diverged irrevocably. Clans had to choose, follow Jamuka and the traditional ways, or follow Temüjin into an uncertain future. More chose Temüjin than anyone expected. There was something about him that inspired not just respect, but devotion. He shared plunder generously with his warriors, promoted men based on ability rather than birth, and demonstrated absolute loyalty to those who followed him. In a world of shifting allegiances, Temüjin was becoming known as a man whose word was iron, whose protection was real. His supporters formally proclaimed him Khan around 1189, a title that drew immediate opposition from those invested in the old tribal order. Jamuka assembled a coalition of 13 tribes, a massive force that dwarfed Temüjin's following. The Battle of Dalan Baljut in 1190 was Temüjin's first major defeat, a brutal reminder that will alone could not overcome superior numbers. His forces were scattered, and he spent months hiding in the mountains, reduced once again to fugitive status. But Jamuka made a critical error. After the victory, he boiled 70 of Temüjin's captured warriors alive in cauldrons, a display of cruelty so excessive that it shocked even the violence-hardened steppe tribes. Warriors began to question whether Jamuka's temperament was suited to leadership. Meanwhile, Temüjin treated captured enemies with calculated mercy, incorporating them into his ranks and earning their loyalty through fair treatment. Over the following years, Temüjin methodically rebuilt his power, forming a crucial alliance with Togrul of the Kerites. Together they began a systematic campaign against the tribes that had opposed them. The Tatars, who had poisoned Temüjin's father years before, were defeated in a campaign of such thoroughness that Temüjin ordered the execution of every Tatar male taller than a cart axle, effectively eliminating them as a tribal entity. It was genocide, calculated and complete, and it sent a message: resistance would not be tolerated. Mercy would not be granted to enemies. The Taichiud, who had abandoned his family and enslaved him as a youth, were crushed. The Merkits, who had taken Berta, were hunted across the steppes. Tribe by tribe, Temüjin absorbed or annihilated opposition, always offering the same choice: submit completely and be incorporated as equals, or resist and face total destruction. There was no middle ground, no partial allegiance. By 1203, only two major obstacles remained: Togrul and Jamuka. The alliance with Togrul collapsed when the Kerite Khan began to fear Temüjin's growing power. In a night battle of desperate intensity, Temüjin's forces defeated the Kerites, and Togrul fled into the wilderness, where he was killed by strangers who didn't recognize him. Jamuka's coalition crumbled shortly after, and the man who had once been Temüjin's closest friend was captured by his own followers and delivered to his former Anda. In 1206, a great Kurultai, an assembly of all the tribes, gathered at the headwaters of the Onon River. Representatives from across the steppes came to witness something that had never happened before: the unification of all Mongol tribes under a single ruler. Temüjin was proclaimed Genghis Khan, a title whose meaning scholars still debate, perhaps universal ruler or oceanic Khan, but whose significance was unmistakable. The age of scattered tribes was over. The Mongol nation had been born. The title of Genghis Khan meant nothing without the power to enforce it, and Genghis understood that unifying the tribes was only the beginning. The real challenge was transforming these disparate warriors, each loyal to their own clan traditions, into a coordinated military force capable of projecting power beyond the steppes. What he created in those first years would become the most effective fighting machine the medieval world had ever seen. The foundation was the decimal system, borrowed from older steppe traditions but implemented with unprecedented rigor. Every warrior was assigned to a unit of 10, called an arban. 10 arbans formed a zun of 100 men. 10 zuns created a mingan of 1,000, and 10 mingans composed a tumen, the fearsome 10,000 that became the basic operational unit of Mongol armies. This structure created clear chains of command and allowed for coordinated maneuvers on a scale that European or Chinese armies could barely imagine. But the genius was not just in organization. It was in who commanded these units. Genghis Khan shattered the old aristocratic system where birth determined rank. In his army, a man from the lowest clan could rise to command a tumen if he demonstrated ability, courage, and loyalty. This meritocracy unleashed talent that the traditional system had kept suppressed for generations. Men like Subutai, a commoner who would become the greatest general of the age, rose to positions of supreme command based purely on their brilliance in warfare. Loyalty was rewarded with a generosity that seemed almost reckless. Genghis distributed plunder with an open hand, keeping relatively little for himself and ensuring that his warriors grew wealthy through conquest. But disloyalty, that was another matter entirely. Traitors were executed with their entire families. Men who broke their word were destroyed. The message was clear: serve faithfully and prosper beyond your dreams, or betray and face absolute annihilation. There was no middle ground. The law code called Yasa was proclaimed, though never written down in full. It codified behavior both in war and peace, creating standards that applied to everyone from Genghis himself down to the lowest warrior. Theft within the army was punishable by death. Adultery meant execution. Desertion in battle was unthinkable. But the code also protected the weak, mandated religious tolerance and established principles of justice that were remarkably egalitarian for the era. Genghis reorganized Mongol society itself. He broke up the old tribal units, deliberately mixing warriors from different clans within each arban. This created loyalty to the army and the Khan rather than to tribal identities. The old allegiances that had fueled centuries of feuding were systematically dismantled. Men who had been enemies a decade before now fought side by side, bound by something stronger than blood, the brotherhood of the Mongol army. The military training was relentless. Every warrior was expected to maintain multiple horses, typically 4 or 5, allowing for incredible mobility and endurance. They could ride for days with minimal rest, covering distances that left pursuers stunned. The composite bow, crafted from layers of horn, sinew, and wood, could penetrate armor at distances that European longbows could not match. Warriors trained from childhood to shoot accurately from horseback at full gallop, a skill that required years to master. Tactics emphasized speed, deception, and coordinated maneuver. The feigned retreat was perfected to an art form. Mongol forces would flee, drawing pursuers into pursuit until they were exhausted and disorganized, then wheel and destroy them with archery and sudden charges. Signal systems using flags and torches allowed for communication across vast distances. Intelligence networks gathered information about enemies long before armies marched. Nothing was left to chance. Genghis also created the Keshig, his personal guard of 10,000 men drawn from the families of his commanders. These warriors served as both bodyguard and officer training corps, learning directly from the Khan and his generals before being sent out to command Temüjins. They were the elite of the elite, and their loyalty was absolute. By 1209, the transformation was complete. The scattered tribes that had spent centuries fighting each other had become something unprecedented, a unified nation with a professional army organized for conquest. They had proven themselves against other steppe peoples, but the real test lay ahead. The great sedentary empires of China, Persia, and Europe had no idea what was coming toward them. The Tangut Empire of Xia controlled the crucial corridor between Mongolia and the Silk Road trading cities, a realm of oasis towns and fortified settlements unlike anything the Mongols had encountered. Here were walls of brick and stone, cities that could not simply be stormed by mounted warriors. The Tanguts had grown wealthy, taxing trade caravans, and their ruler viewed the Mongol request for submission with contempt. It was a fatal mistake. Genghis Khan led his army south in 1209, and the Tanguts quickly learned that walls were not the protection they imagined. The Mongols had incorporated Chinese engineers captured in border raids, men who understood siege warfare. But even without sophisticated equipment, Mongol tactics proved devastatingly effective. They diverted rivers to flood cities, built siege towers, and most importantly, demonstrated a patience that surprised defenders. They would surround a city and simply wait, knowing that time was on their side. The psychological warfare was perhaps more effective than the physical siege. Mongol envoys would approach city walls with a simple message: surrender now and be incorporated into the empire with your lives and property intact, or resist and face total destruction. To prove they meant it when cities did resist, the Mongols massacred entire populations, leaving pyramids of skulls as warnings to the next target. It was terror as military strategy, calculated to make future conquests easier. After several cities fell, the Tangut Emperor sued for peace, offering tribute and nominal submission. Genghis accepted, having achieved his objective, access to the Silk Road, and proof that his army could conquer settled civilizations. More importantly, he had acquired engineers, siege weapons, and knowledge that would prove invaluable in future campaigns. The Xia campaign was a laboratory where the Mongols learned to conquer the unconquerable. The Jin dynasty of northern China was a far more formidable opponent. Ruled by the Jurchen people who had conquered the region a century before, the Jin controlled vast territories, commanded armies numbered in hundreds of thousands, and possessed fortifications that had resisted nomad attacks for generations. Their capital, Zhongdu, modern Beijing, was one of the greatest cities in the world, protected by walls that seemed impregnable. Genghis found his pretext for war in 1211 when the Jin emperor demanded that he kowtow in submission. For a man who now styled himself universal ruler, such a demand was intolerable. The Mongol army crossed the Gobi Desert and fell upon Jin territory like a storm that had been gathering for 1,000 years. Initial battles went to the Mongols, whose mobility and tactics overwhelmed the more conventional Jin forces, but the fortified cities remained beyond reach. The key breakthrough came through defection. A Khitan nobleman named Yelu Ahai, whose people had been conquered by the Jin, brought his forces over to Genghis along with crucial intelligence about Jin military dispositions and weaknesses. Other defections followed as oppressed minorities within the Jin Empire saw the Mongols as liberators rather than conquerors. Genghis exploited these divisions ruthlessly, incorporating local forces and learning from their knowledge of Chinese warfare. For 4 years, the campaign ground on. Mongol armies swept across northern China, besieging cities, destroying Jin armies in the field, and slowly tightening the noose around Zhongdu. The Jin emperor fled south, abandoning his capital, a decision that proved fatal to Jin morale. In 1215, after a siege that reduced the population to starvation and cannibalism, Zhongdu fell. The Mongols spent a month looting and burning the city. The smoke was reportedly visible for weeks. The fall of Zhongdu marked a turning point in world history. The Mongols had proven they could not only defeat, but conquer one of the great empires of the age. Genghis now controlled territories vastly larger and more populous than Mongolia itself. The challenge was no longer whether the Mongols could conquer civilizations, it was whether they could govern them. Genghis left administrators to manage the conquered territories, incorporating Chinese bureaucrats who understood taxation and administration. The Mongol Empire was evolving from a nomadic horde into something that resembled a true empire, though one built on foundations of terror and absolute submission. To the west of the Mongol realm lay the Khwarezmian Empire, a vast Islamic state stretching from the borders of India to the shores of the Caspian Sea. Its ruler, Shah Ala ad-Din Muhammad, commanded armies numbering in the hundreds of thousands and controlled some of the wealthiest cities on earth, Samarkand, Bukhara, and Merv, jewels of Islamic civilization where scholars debated philosophy and poets crafted verses that would endure for centuries. In 1218, Genghis Khan had no intention of conquering this empire. His focus remained on completing the subjugation of the Jin dynasty in China. What he wanted from the Khwarezmian realm was trade, the kind of mutually beneficial commerce that enriched both sides and required no bloodshed. He sent a caravan of 500 merchants, many of them Muslims themselves, carrying gold, silver, jade, and the finest products of China. It was a gesture of peace, an opening of dialogue between two great powers. The caravan reached the border city of Otrar, where the governor, Inalchuk, made a decision that would doom millions. Perhaps motivated by greed, perhaps suspecting the merchants were spies, he seized the entire caravan and executed every member. It was not just robbery, it was an act of war disguised as border enforcement. When news reached Genghis, he did what protocol demanded. He sent ambassadors to Shah Muhammad requesting justice, the punishment of the guilty governor and restitution for the losses. The Shah's response revealed either breathtaking arrogance or catastrophic miscalculation. He had the head ambassador executed and sent the others back with their beards burned off, the ultimate insult in both Mongol and Islamic culture. It was a declaration that the Khwarezmian Empire neither feared the Mongols nor respected their demands. Shah Muhammad had crossed a line from which there could be no return. Genghis Khan's rage was legendary, but it was not the blind fury of a barbarian. It was the cold, calculated anger of a man who understood that this insult could not go unanswered without undermining everything he had built. He suspended operations in China, recalled his generals, and assembled an army of perhaps 200,000 warriors. The Mongol war machine turned west, and with it came a storm of vengeance that would reshape the Islamic world. The invasion began in 1219 with a strategy that demonstrated Genghis's evolved understanding of warfare. Rather than simply attacking the nearest cities, he divided his forces into multiple columns that swept across the empire simultaneously, creating panic and preventing coordinated defense. Shah Muhammad, despite his vast armies, made the fatal error of dispersing his forces to garrison individual cities rather than concentrating them to meet the Mongols in the field. The city of Otrar, where the caravan had been murdered, received special attention. Genghis assigned the siege to one of his sons while he moved on to greater targets, but he made sure the city understood why it was being destroyed. When Otrar finally fell after a 5-month siege, Governor Inalchuk was captured alive. Genghis had molten silver poured into his eyes and ears, a symbolic punishment for the man who had been too blind and deaf to understand the consequences of his actions. Bukhara fell next, one of the greatest centers of Islamic learning. When Genghis entered the city's grand mosque, he climbed upon the pulpit and declared, "I am the punishment of God. If you had not committed great sins, God would not have sent a punishment like me upon you." Whether he actually said these words or whether they were invented by later chroniclers matters less than the fact that they captured how the Mongols were perceived as divine retribution made flesh. Samarkand, even more magnificent than Bukhara, surrendered after only 5 days when it became clear that resistance meant annihilation. But the city of Nishapur made the mistake of killing Genghis's son-in-law Tokchar during the siege. When it finally fell, Genghis ordered that every living thing in the city be killed: men, women, children, even cats and dogs. The heads were arranged in pyramids, separated by gender. Nishapur ceased to exist. The Shah fled before the Mongol advance, pursued by a force of 20,000 cavalry under generals Subutai and Jebe. They chased him across Persia, through mountain passes and across deserts, a pursuit of nearly 2 years that covered thousands of miles. Muhammad eventually died on an island in the Caspian Sea, broken and alone, his vast empire shattered in less than 2 years. The Khwarezmian Empire, which had seemed invincible, was erased from existence with a thoroughness that shocked the medieval world. With Shah Muhammad dead and his empire in ruins, most commanders would have declared victory and returned home. But Genghis Khan's generals Subutai and Jebe were not most commanders. They stood at the edge of the known world with 20,000 of the finest cavalry ever assembled, and they saw not obstacles, but opportunities. They requested permission to continue west, to probe the lands beyond Persia, to see what lay in the territories that Mongol scouts had barely glimpsed. Genghis granted permission for what would become one of the most extraordinary military expeditions in history, a reconnaissance in force that would circle the Caspian Sea, penetrate deep into the Caucasus, and ultimately reach the steppes of southern Russia. It was thousands of miles from their homeland, through territories they had never seen, against enemies they had never fought. For 2 years, these 20,000 warriors would operate with complete independence, living off the land and the spoils of conquest. The expedition moved north around the Caspian Sea, entering the Caucasus Mountains where Georgian and Armenian kingdoms had flourished for centuries. The The Christian kingdoms there, hardened by centuries of warfare against Turkish and Persian invaders, expected to defeat what they saw as just another nomadic raiding party. The Battle of Cunan in 1221 taught them otherwise. Georgian forces, including their famed heavy cavalry, were destroyed with the precision that had become the Mongol trademark. The Mongols demonstrated a flexibility that constantly surprised their enemies. In the mountains, they abandoned their usual tactics of sweeping cavalry charges and instead used their bows to ambush forces in narrow passes. They gathered intelligence obsessively, using merchants, prisoners, and local guides to understand the geography and politics of each region before attacking. They exploited every weakness, every division between Christian kingdoms, every grudge between rival princes. Emerging from the Caucasus onto the steppes north of the Black Sea, the Mongol expedition encountered a civilization that should have been familiar: the Cumans, a Turkic nomadic people whose culture and military tactics resembled their own. But the Cumans had grown soft through proximity to sedentary civilizations, hiring themselves as mercenaries to Russian princes and losing the hard edge that characterized the Mongols. When battle was joined, the result was predictable. The Cumans were routed and fled north, seeking protection from their Russian allies. The Russian princes faced a difficult decision. The Cumans were sometimes allies, sometimes enemies, but always useful as a buffer against threats from the steppe. If they fell, the Mongol horde would be at Russia's doorstep. Prince Mstislav the Bold convinced his fellow princes that they should march south to meet this threat before it reached their territories. It was a decision made from courage and strategic logic, but it failed to account for what these particular enemies represented. The Mongol generals sent envoys to the Russian princes with a message of calculated deception. They had no quarrel with the Russians, only with the Cumans who had opposed them. The princes executed the envoys, a mistake they would soon regret. But the message served its purpose, sowing division and buying time for the Mongols to choose their battlefield. The Battle of the Kalka River in May 1223 became a masterclass in Mongol tactics. For 9 days, Subutais' forces retreated before the pursuing Russian army, drawing them deeper into the steppe and further from support. The Russians, confident of victory, allowed their formations to become strung out and poorly coordinated. When the Mongols finally turned to fight, they did so on ground of their choosing. With their forces fresh and the enemy exhausted, the Russian army was destroyed so completely that only 1 in 10 warriors returned home. Princes were captured and, in a grimly symbolic gesture, placed under wooden boards while the Mongols held their victory feast atop them, literally celebrating on the bodies of their enemies. The message was clear: those who killed Mongol envoys faced fates worse than death. Yet remarkably, after this devastating victory, Subutai and Jebe did not invade Russia. They had accomplished their mission of reconnaissance, gathered intelligence about the lands to the west, and demonstrated Mongol power to civilizations that had never imagined such warriors existed. They turned east, riding back across thousands of miles to rejoin Genghis Khan, completing one of history's most audacious military expeditions. They had circumnavigated an entire sea, defeated kingdoms in 3 different regions, and returned with maps, intelligence, and prisoners who could teach the Mongols about European warfare. The raid west was complete, but it was also a promise: the Mongols would return. When Subutai and Jebe returned from their great raid west, they found Genghis Khan already preparing for what would be his final campaign. The Tangut Empire of Shixia, which had submitted years before, had made the fatal error of refusing to provide troops for the Khwarezmian campaign. To Genghis, this was not merely disobedience, it was betrayal of the most fundamental sort. The Tanguts had sworn submission, accepted his protection, and then withdrawn their support when he needed it most. But there was more than anger driving Genghis toward this final war. He was in his 60s now, an extraordinary age for a warrior who had spent his entire life in the saddle and on campaign. His body bore the accumulated damage of decades of warfare, old wounds that ached in cold weather, joints stiffened by years of hard riding. The weariness that comes when a man begins to sense the approach of his own ending. The campaign against Xia began in 1226, and from the start it carried an air of grim finality. Genghis prosecuted the war with methodical brutality, systematically reducing Tangut cities one after another. There would be no mercy this time, no opportunity for submission. The Tanguts had taught him a lesson he would not forget. Conquered peoples needed to understand that submission was eternal. That oath-breaking carried consequences so terrible that no one would dare repeat the offense. During the siege of one city, disaster struck in a way that no enemy army had managed. Genghis was thrown from his horse during a hunt, suffering injuries that refused to heal properly. His generals urged him to return to Mongolia to rest and recover, but he refused. The campaign would continue. The Tanguts would be punished. His will was iron, even as his body began to fail. Through the winter of 1226 and into 1227, the campaign ground on. Genghis directed operations from his sickbed, his mind still sharp, even as his strength ebbed. He knew death was approaching, and he began to prepare for it with the same methodical planning he had brought to every conquest. He summoned his sons and closest generals to his tent and spoke to them of the future, of how the empire should be governed after his death. His instructions revealed the strategic mind that had built an empire. He outlined how his sons should continue the war against the Jin dynasty in China, exploiting divisions between Jin and Song territories. He emphasized the importance of unity among the royal family, knowing that succession struggles had destroyed empires before. And he made one final terrible command regarding the Tanguts. They were to be exterminated completely, erased from history as punishment for their betrayal. In August 1227, in the midst of the campaign, Genghis Khan died. The exact cause remains disputed by historians. Some sources suggest complications from his fall from the horse. Others mention illness, possibly typhoid fever. The precise details matter less than the fact that the man who had unified the Mongol tribes and launched them on a path of world conquest was gone. But even in death, Genghis commanded absolute obedience. His body was taken back to Mongolia in secret, the funeral procession killing anyone who witnessed it to preserve the secrecy of his burial location. To this day, the exact site of Genghis Khan's tomb remains unknown, hidden somewhere in the Mongolian wilderness he had once called home. It was fitting, perhaps, that the man who had conquered half the known world should rest in a place no one could find. Before news of his death was announced, the Tangut capital fell. The Mongol army carried out Genghis's final command with ruthless efficiency. The Tangut royal family was executed, the population massacred, the cities razed. The Tangut people, who had maintained their distinctive culture for centuries, effectively ceased to exist as a separate civilization. It was genocide as final statement, a demonstration that defying Genghis Khan carried consequences that extended beyond death itself. The empire he left behind controlled territory stretching from the Pacific Ocean to the Caspian Sea. It encompassed dozens of formerly independent kingdoms, hundreds of cities, and millions of people who now lived under Mongol rule. He had transformed the Mongols from scattered tribes into a world power, created a military system that would dominate warfare for generations, and established a legacy that would shape Eurasia for centuries to come. Yet perhaps the most remarkable aspect of Genghis Khan's achievement was this: the empire did not collapse with his death. The systems he had created, the laws he had established, the loyalty he had inspired, all of it endured. His sons and generals would continue his conquests, expanding the empire even further than he had. The storm he had unleashed would rage for decades more, and the world would never be the same. The death of Genghis Khan could have shattered the empire into warring factions, as had happened to so many conquests before. Yet the great Khan had chosen his successor with the same strategic calculation he brought to warfare. Ogedai, his third son, was not the eldest, nor was he the most brilliant military commander. But he possessed something perhaps more valuable, the ability to build consensus, to administer conquered territories, and to transform a nomadic confederation into something resembling a functional empire. For 2 years after Genghis's death, the empire waited. Tradition demanded a kurultai, a gathering of all princes and commanders, to formally elect the new Great Khan. When the assembly finally convened in 1229, Ogedai was confirmed as his father's chosen heir, though not without tension. His older brother Chagatai had claims, as did his younger brother Tolui, but Genghis's will prevailed even from beyond the grave. The empire would remain united, at least for now. Ogedai's first great project revealed his vision for what the Mongol Empire could become. The nomadic lifestyle that had forged Mongol power was inadequate for governing sedentary civilizations. The empire needed a capital, a fixed point of administration and culture. He chose a site in the Orphan Valley called Karakorum, where ancient Turkic Khans had once ruled, and began construction of a city that would become the heart of the Mongol world. Karakorum was unlike any city the steppes had known. Craftsmen and architects from conquered territories, China, Persia, Europe, were brought to build palaces, workshops, and temples. The city became a cosmopolitan center, where Buddhist monks debated with Muslim scholars, where Nestorian Christians built churches beside shamanistic shrines, where merchants from Venice traded alongside caravans from Beijing. It was Ogedai's statement that the Mongol Empire would not simply conquer civilizations, but incorporate and synthesize them. But Ogedai was not merely a builder of cities. He understood that his father's conquests had to be completed and consolidated. In China, the Jin dynasty still controlled vast territories in the north, wounded but not defeated. Ogedai personally led campaigns to finish what Genghis had begun, and in 1234, after years of grinding warfare, the Jin dynasty finally collapsed. The conquest had taken nearly 3 decades, but northern China was now fully incorporated into the Mongol realm. The administrative systems Ogedai established revealed sophistication that contradicted European stereotypes of Mongol barbarism. He implemented a postal system called the Yam, with stations every 25 miles providing fresh horses and supplies for messengers. Information could travel from one end of the empire to the other faster than in any previous civilization. He standardized taxation, replacing the arbitrary plundering of the early conquests with systematic revenue collection that, while still heavy, was at least predictable. He also addressed one of the fundamental challenges of nomadic rule over agricultural societies. Mongol commanders wanted to convert farmland into pasture for their horses. Ogedai's Chinese advisors convinced him that taxing farmers produced more wealth than grazing horses on their fields. It was a crucial decision that preserved the agricultural base of conquered territories and demonstrated that the Mongols could learn from the civilizations they conquered. Yet Ogedai struggled with demons that undermined his health and judgment. His drinking became legendary and problematic, with court chroniclers recording sessions where he consumed enough alcohol to kill lesser men. His brother Chagatai, assigned to monitor his drinking, tried various strategies to limit the damage, but Ogedai was the great Khan who could truly control him. The alcohol may have dulled the stress of ruling an empire that stretched across most of Eurasia, but it also shortened his life. Despite these personal failings, Ogedei's reign saw the Mongol Empire reach its greatest extent. He dispatched armies in multiple directions simultaneously, west into Europe, south into China, east into Korea. The coordination required to manage these simultaneous campaigns across thousands of miles was unprecedented. Supply lines stretched across deserts and mountains. Intelligence networks gathered information from dozens of kingdoms, and diplomatic envoys negotiated with everyone from the Pope to the Song Emperor. Ogedei also demonstrated a capacity for mercy that his father had rarely shown. When the Korean kingdom finally submitted after years of resistance, he accepted their surrender and incorporated them as vassals rather than destroying them completely. When cities surrendered quickly, he honored the terms he offered. This combination of overwhelming force and conditional mercy became a tool of conquest. Resistance meant annihilation, but submission could lead to survival and even prosperity within the empire. By 1241, the Mongol Empire was the largest contiguous land empire in human history, and Ogedei Khan ruled it from Karakoram with a combination of his father's strategic vision and his own administrative genius. But the greatest test of his reign was still unfolding in the west, where Mongol armies were about to bring Europe to the brink of complete conquest. Europe in 1237 was a fractured continent of competing kingdoms, feuding princes, and religious divisions. The Crusades had drained resources and attention toward the Holy Land, while internal conflicts consumed whatever energy remained. Into this divided landscape rode an army that would become Europe's nightmare, commanded by Batu Khan, grandson of Genghis, with the brilliant general Subutai as his chief strategist. The invasion began not with Europe, but with the Russian principalities, the same lands that Subutai had raided 15 years earlier. This time, there would be no reconnaissance. This was conquest, systematic and total. The Mongol army that crossed into Russian territory numbered perhaps 150,000 warriors, the largest force yet assembled for a Western campaign. They came in winter when the rivers froze solid and became highways for their horses. When European armies expected campaigning to be impossible, Ryazan was the first major Russian city to fall. In December 1237, the prince refused demands for submission, declaring he would surrender only when we are all dead. The Mongols obliged him. After 5 days of siege, the city was stormed, and every living soul was killed. Churches offered no sanctuary, priests were slaughtered at their altars, and the buildings were burned with refugees still inside. It was not random violence, but calculated terror, a message to every other city about the cost of resistance. Vladimir, the capital of the most powerful Russian principality, received the same treatment in February 1238. Despite desperate defense and winter conditions that should have favored the defenders, the Mongol siege engines battered down walls that had stood for generations. The Grand Prince fled, and his family was burned alive in a cathedral. The city that had been the jewel of northeastern Russia became a charnel house, where the only sound was the crows feeding on corpses. For 3 years, the Mongols systematically destroyed Russian resistance. City after city fell. Moscow, then little more than a wooden fort, was burned. Kozelsk, a minor town, held out for 7 weeks through sheer desperation, and when it finally fell, the Mongols killed everyone, including the children, and renamed it the City of Sorrow. By 1240, when Kiev fell after a siege that left the city's magnificent churches in ruins, Russian power was broken so completely that it would take centuries to recover. But Subutai's strategic vision extended far beyond Russia. In 1241, the Mongol army split into several columns and invaded Central Europe simultaneously. One force moved through Poland toward Germany, another through Hungary toward Austria. The coordination required to execute this strategy across hundreds of miles, through unknown territory, against multiple enemies, demonstrated military planning decades ahead of its time. The Battle of Legnica in April 1241 shattered the myth of European military superiority. A combined force of Polish knights, German crusaders, and Templar warriors, the finest heavy cavalry in Christendom, charged the Mongol positions with the confidence born of centuries of dominance. The Mongols executed their classic feigned retreat, drawing the European cavalry into pursuit until they were exhausted and disorganized, then turned and destroyed them with archery and coordinated charges. The European commander, Duke Henry the Pious, was killed, and the Mongols reportedly filled 9 bags with ears cut from the dead. 2 days later, at the Battle of Mohi in Hungary, an even larger European army met the same fate. King Bela Thafir of Hungary commanded perhaps 60,000 men, protected by a fortified camp. Subutai divided his forces, pinning the Hungarians from the front, while sending cavalry around to attack from the rear. When the European army finally broke and fled, the Mongols pursued for days, hunting down survivors with methodical efficiency. Estimates suggest that over half the Hungarian nobility died in the battle and its aftermath. Europe stood defenseless. The Mongol army was within striking distance of Vienna, with nothing between them and the heart of Western Europe but disorganized, terrified kingdoms. Chroniclers wrote of the apocalypse, of divine judgment, of the end times prophesied in Scripture. Pope Gregory IX called for a crusade, but who would fight? The finest warriors of Poland and Hungary lay dead in fields already picked clean by scavengers. Then, in December 1241, news reached Batu Khan that changed everything. Ögedei was dead. Mongol law required all princes to return for the Kurultai to elect a new great Khan. Batu began the long journey back to Mongolia, and with him went the army that had brought Europe to its knees. The invasion ended not through European resistance, but through an accident of timing that seemed almost miraculous to the terrified continent. Europe had been granted a reprieve it had done nothing to earn. The Mongols would never return in such force, distracted by internal succession struggles and campaigns in other directions. But the memory of those terrible years would haunt European consciousness for generations. The realization that their vaunted knights and castle walls meant nothing against an enemy who fought with such unprecedented coordination and ruthlessness. The death of Ögedei plunged the Mongol Empire into years of political maneuvering and intrigue. His son Guyuk eventually became Great Khan in 1246, but his reign lasted only 2 years before his own death under suspicious circumstances. The succession struggle that followed revealed deep factions within the royal family, divisions that threatened to tear apart everything Genghis Khan had built. Into this dangerous vacuum stepped Mongke, grandson of Genghis through Tolui's line, a man who would restore order through methods his grandfather would have recognized. Mongke's path to power was paved with blood. In 1251, with the support of Batu Khan, the conqueror of Russia and most senior prince, he was proclaimed Great Khan at a Kurultai. But members of Ögedei's and Chagatai's lineages contested this, seeing it as a usurpation of their rights. Mongke's response was swift and brutal. He conducted a purge of unprecedented scale, executing princes, generals, and officials suspected of disloyalty. Dozens of members of the royal family were killed, and their supporters were hunted down across the empire. It was fratricide on a massive scale, but it accomplished its purpose. No one would challenge Mongke's authority again. With internal opposition crushed, Mongke turned to the mission that defined his reign, the completion of his grandfather's conquests. 2 targets dominated his strategic vision: the Song dynasty in southern China and the Islamic world, particularly the Abbasid Caliphate in Baghdad. These were not random choices, but the 2 greatest powers remaining outside Mongol control, civilizations that represented centuries of accumulated wealth, knowledge, and cultural achievement. The Song dynasty had survived Mongol aggression by retreating south of the Yangtze River, where the geography favored defense. This was a land of rivers, rice paddies, and fortified cities, terrain that negated the Mongol advantages of cavalry mobility. Mongke understood that conquering the Song would require a different kind of warfare: patient siege operations, naval power, and the systematic reduction of fortified positions. He assigned this campaign to his brother Kublai, recognizing that it would take years, perhaps decades, to complete. The technology of siege warfare had evolved dramatically since Genghis Khan's early campaigns. Mongol armies now routinely included Chinese and Persian engineers who could construct trebuchets capable of hurling projectiles weighing hundreds of pounds. They built siege towers on wheels, designed battering rams that could break through gates reinforced with iron, and developed incendiary weapons that could set wooden fortifications ablaze from a distance. The Mongols had become masters of a type of warfare their ancestors would barely have recognized. But Mongke's attention was primarily focused westward, toward the heart of the Islamic world. The Abbasid Caliphate, though weakened from its golden age, still represented the spiritual and cultural center of Sunni Islam. Baghdad, its capital, was one of the greatest cities on earth, a center of learning where the House of Wisdom had preserved and expanded upon Greek philosophy, where mathematicians had developed algebra, where astronomers had mapped the heavens with unprecedented accuracy. For this campaign, Mongke chose his brother Hulagu, giving him perhaps the largest army ever assembled for a single Mongol campaign. Some sources suggest over 100,000 warriors, along with siege engineers, supply trains, and administrative personnel. The force that departed Mongolia in 1253 was not a raiding party but an army of conquest and occupation, equipped to destroy the most sophisticated civilization in the Islamic world. Hulagu's mission was clear: subjugate or destroy every power between Mongolia and Egypt. Mongke had studied the failures of earlier campaigns and understood that leaving powerful enemies in the Mongol rear created vulnerability. This campaign would be thorough, methodical, and absolutely ruthless. There would be no temporary submissions, no nominal vassalage, only complete conquest or total destruction. Mongke himself led the campaign against the Song, establishing his headquarters in southern China and personally directing operations. It was a demonstration that the great Khan was not content to rule from a palace, but would lead his armies as his grandfather had. The siege operations were grinding and brutal, with both sides suffering enormous casualties. Fortified cities held out for months, their defenders knowing that surrender often meant massacre. In 1257, Mongke received troubling news from the Western Front. Hulagu had encountered an enemy unlike any the Mongols had faced before. The Nizari Ismailis, known to Europeans as the Assassins, occupied mountain fortresses throughout Persia that seemed impregnable to conventional assault. These were warriors who had perfected the art of political murder, who struck from the shadows and disappeared like smoke. Hulagu's campaign against them was testing the limits of Mongol siege capabilities. But Mongke had confidence in his brother and in the Mongol system of warfare that had evolved over 50 years of conquest. The empire now possessed not just the finest cavalry in the world, but the most advanced siege technology, the most sophisticated logistics, and a tradition of victory that made Mongol armies believe they were invincible. The campaigns in China and the Islamic world would be the culmination of everything Genghis Khan had begun, the final proof that Mongol power was truly universal. The Nizari Ismailis, feared across the Islamic world as the Assassins, had perfected a form of warfare that rendered conventional armies irrelevant. From mountain fortresses scattered across Persia, they dispatched killers who struck at sultans and caliphs with such precision that entire kingdoms paid them tribute simply to be left alone. Their Grand Master, the so-called Old Man of the Mountain, ruled from the impregnable fortress of Alamut, perched on cliffs that seemed to touch the sky itself. Hulagu's army arrived before these fortresses in 1256, and the assassins watched with confidence born of centuries of invincibility. No army had ever taken their strongholds. The mountains themselves were their walls, the narrow passes their moats. But they had never faced Mongol siege engineers. Catapults were hauled up mountain paths on the backs of thousands of laborers. Siege towers were constructed from timber carried hundreds of miles. The Mongols demonstrated a patience that unnerved defenders accustomed to enemies who gave up after weeks of futile assault. Alamut fell after a siege that combined military pressure with psychological warfare. Hulagu sent messages promising mercy for surrender while simultaneously demonstrating what resistance would bring by massacring the populations of smaller fortresses. When the Grand Master finally emerged to negotiate, he was treated with superficial respect before being sent to meet Mongol Khan in Mongolia, a journey from which he would never return. One by one, the assassin fortresses surrendered or were stormed. The organization that had terrorized the Islamic world for over a century was systematically dismantled, its warriors killed, its libraries burned. With the assassins eliminated, only one major obstacle remained before Hulagu: Baghdad itself, the city of peace, capital of the Abbasid Caliphate for 500 years. Here lived Caliph al-Mustasim, claiming descent from the Prophet's uncle, spiritual leader of Sunni Islam, ruler of a city that held perhaps 1 million souls. The caliph had grown complacent in his power, surrounded by advisors who assured him that no force would dare attack the representative of God on earth. Hulagu sent the customary demand for submission. The caliph's response was defiant, almost mocking. He commanded the armies of Islam, he claimed, and if the Mongols approached, warriors from across the Muslim world would rise to defend the faith. It was a catastrophic miscalculation. Those armies existed more in theory than reality, and the fractured Islamic world was too consumed by its own divisions to mount a coordinated defense. The Mongol army that surrounded Baghdad in January 1258 was the culmination of 50 years of military evolution. Siege engines surrounded the city's walls, positioned with mathematical precision. Supply lines stretched back thousands of miles, ensuring the army could maintain the siege indefinitely. Intelligence networks had already identified weaknesses in the defenses, potential collaborators within the city, the locations of treasuries and granaries. The assault began with a bombardment that shook the ancient walls. For 2 weeks, siege engines hurled stones and incendiary materials into the city, while miners worked beneath walls, digging tunnels that would collapse the fortifications. When sections of wall finally crumbled, Mongol warriors poured through gaps like water through a broken dam. The caliph, recognizing that resistance was futile, emerged to negotiate surrender. Hulagu received him with courtesy, then demanded he order his remaining forces to lay down their weapons. What followed was calculated extermination. Mongol forces methodically moved through the city, separating people by profession and faith. Craftsmen and artisans who possessed useful skills were spared and sent east as prisoners. Christians and some Jews were protected, partly through the influence of Hulagu's Christian wife Dox Khatun. But the Muslim population faced systematic massacre. For weeks, the killing continued until the streets were rivers of blood and the smell of death hung over the city like a miasma. The caliph himself was executed in a manner designed to respect Mongol superstition about spilling royal blood. He was wrapped in carpets and trampled by horses, his body broken but no blood visibly shed. With him died not just a man but an institution. The Abbasid Caliphate, which had guided Sunni Islam for half a millennium, ceased to exist. It was as if the Pope had been killed and Rome destroyed, a blow to Islamic civilization that resonated for centuries. Libraries that had preserved knowledge from the ancient world were burned. The House of Wisdom, where scholars had translated Greek philosophy and advanced mathematics and astronomy, was destroyed. Chroniclers claimed the Tigris River ran black with ink from the countless manuscripts thrown into its waters, then ran red with the blood of scholars slaughtered in their studies. Whether literally true or not, the image captured the magnitude of cultural destruction. Baghdad, which had been among the greatest cities in the world, was reduced to a fraction of its former glory. Estimates of the death toll ranged from 200,000 to over 1 million, numbers so large that accuracy became meaningless. What mattered was that one of civilization's crown jewels had been systematically destroyed, and the Islamic world would never recover its former unity or confidence. In 1259, while leading the campaign against the Song dynasty in southern China, Great Khan Mongke died, possibly from dysentery, possibly from wounds sustained during a siege. His death created a succession crisis that would split the Mongol Empire into competing factions. Two of his brothers, Kublai and Arik Böke, both claimed the title of Great Khan, and for the first time since Genghis Khan's death, the empire stood on the brink of civil war. Kublai was campaigning deep in Song territory when news of Mongke's death reached him. He immediately withdrew north, understanding that the struggle for supreme power would be decided not on battlefields against enemies, but in the political maneuvering among Mongol princes. Arik Böke, who had remained in Karakorum as regent, moved quickly to convene a Kurultai and have himself proclaimed Great Khan. He represented the conservative faction, Mongols who wanted to preserve traditional steppe culture and resist assimilation into the sedentary civilizations they had conquered. Kublai represented something different, a vision of the Mongol Empire as a true synthesis of nomadic and civilized cultures, adapting Chinese administrative practices while maintaining Mongol military supremacy. He convened his own Kurultai in 1260, held in China rather than Mongolia, and was proclaimed Great Khan by supporters who included many of the empire's most capable generals and administrators. The empire now had two Great Khans, and only war would decide which claim was legitimate. The civil war lasted 4 years, a conflict fought across Mongolia and northern China. Kublai's advantages were substantial. He controlled the wealth of conquered Chinese territories, had access to agricultural resources, and commanded the loyalty of experienced generals. Arik Böke held Karakorum and the steppe heartland, but could not match Kublai's economic resources. By 1264, Arik Böke's position had become untenable, and he surrendered. Kublai, demonstrating a capacity for mercy unusual in Mongol succession struggles, allowed his brother to live, though he died shortly thereafter, under circumstances that remained suspicious. Kublai's victory came at a cost. The unity of the Mongol Empire was fractured permanently. The Western Khanates, the Golden Horde in Russia, the Chagatai Khanate in Central Asia, and Hulagu's Ilkhanate in Persia, recognized Kublai as nominal Great Khan but operated with increasing independence. The universal empire Genghis Khan had created was evolving into a federation of related but separate states. Kublai accepted this reality and focused his energy on what he could control: China. The Song dynasty remained the great unfinished conquest, a wealthy and sophisticated civilization that had resisted Mongol power for decades. The Song had retreated to southern China, where geography provided natural defenses. The Yangtze River was a formidable barrier. The landscape of rivers and rice paddies negated cavalry advantages, and fortified cities could withstand sieges for months or years. Kublai understood that conquering the Song would require patience, resources, and adaptation to unfamiliar forms of warfare. He began by building a navy, an extraordinary step for a people whose entire military tradition centered on mounted warfare. Chinese shipbuilders constructed fleets capable of operating on rivers and coastal waters. Mongol warriors learned to fight from ships, adapting their tactics to an environment that would have baffled their grandfathers. It was a demonstration of the Mongol capacity for learning and adaptation that had made them so successful. The campaign unfolded slowly, methodically. Mongol forces established strongpoints along the Yangtze, systematically reducing Song fortifications and cutting off their supply lines. Cities were besieged with the same patience Mongols had shown at Baghdad and Alamut. When resistance proved particularly stubborn, Kublai was willing to negotiate, offering generous terms to commanders who surrendered, incorporating Song officials and generals into his administration. In 1271, Kublai made a decision that symbolized his evolving vision. He proclaimed a new dynasty, the Yuan, and styled himself not as a Mongol Khan but as a Chinese emperor. It was a revolutionary step that horrified traditionalists but reflected political reality. To rule China effectively required adopting Chinese forms of legitimacy, even while maintaining Mongol military supremacy. Kublai moved his capital from Karakoram to a new city called Dadu, modern Beijing, designed by Chinese architects, but serving Mongol imperial needs. The final Song resistance collapsed in 1279 when their last fleet was destroyed at the Battle of Yamen. The Song boy emperor, barely 8 years old, was thrown into the sea by a loyal minister rather than allow his capture. With his death, Song resistance ended. For the first time in centuries, all of China was united under a single ruler, and that ruler was a foreign conqueror. Yet Kublai's achievement was more than military. He had created a hybrid state that preserved Chinese civilization while asserting Mongol dominance. The year 1260 marked a turning point that few recognized at the time. The Mongol advance finally met an enemy it could not overcome. In the dust and heat of Palestine, at a place called Ain Jalut, the Springs of Goliath, Mongol and Mamluk armies clashed in a battle that would shatter the myth of Mongol invincibility and save the Islamic world from the fate that had befallen Baghdad. Hulagu had withdrawn the bulk of his forces from the Levant, either due to succession struggles following Mönch's death or because the region's limited pasture land could not support a large Mongol army. He left behind perhaps 20,000 warriors under the general Kitbuka, a Nestorian Christian whose faith made him particularly aggressive toward Muslim territories. The Mamluks of Egypt, meanwhile, had been preparing for this confrontation with desperate intensity, knowing they represented Islam's last military power of significance. The Mamluk Sultan, Qutuz, led his army north into Palestine with approximately 20,000 warriors, former slave soldiers who had been trained from childhood in warfare and who had overthrown their masters to seize power in Egypt. They were matched in skill and ferocity to the Mongols, and they understood that defeat meant not just their deaths, but the end of Islamic civilization as they knew it. Everything depended on this battle. Kitbuka deployed his forces using classic Mongol tactics, sending forward a vanguard to engage the enemy while keeping his main force in reserve for the decisive strike. But the Mamluks had studied Mongol warfare, learned from the disasters at Baghdad and elsewhere. When the Mongol vanguard charged, the Mamluk forces under Baibars executed a fighting retreat, drawing the Mongols forward into terrain that negated their mobility advantages, rough ground broken by hills and valleys. The battle raged for hours, cavalry charges meeting counter-charges, arrows darkening the sky, warriors fighting with the desperation of men who knew this was civilization's last stand. When Kitbuka committed his reserves, expecting to break the Mamluk lines, he found instead that he had been drawn into a trap. Fresh Mamluk forces held in reserve struck his flanks. The Mongol army, outnumbered and outmaneuvered, began to break. Kitbuka himself was captured and executed. his death marking the first time a Mongol general commanding a major army had been defeated and killed by an enemy. The survivors fled east, and the Mamluks reclaimed the territories that Mongol forces had occupied. The Mongol advance into the Middle East was permanently halted. The psychological impact was immense. The Mongols could be beaten, and the Islamic world had found defenders capable of matching them in battle. But if Ain Jalut represented a strategic defeat, the Mongol campaigns against Japan were catastrophes of a different order. Kublai Khan, having completed the conquest of China, turned his attention to the island nation that had never submitted to foreign rule. In 1274, he dispatched a fleet carrying perhaps 30,000 warriors, Mongol, Chinese, and Korean across the Sea of Japan to compel submission through force. The invasion force landed on the shores of Kyushu and quickly overwhelmed the samurai defenders, whose individual combat skills were no match for coordinated Mongol tactics and explosive projectiles the Japanese had never encountered. The Japanese seemed on the verge of catastrophic defeat when fortune intervened. A storm struck the Mongol fleet, destroying hundreds of ships and forcing the invasion force to withdraw. It was a reprieve that seemed almost miraculous to the desperate Japanese. Kublai, however, was not deterred by a single failure. For 7 years, he prepared a second invasion on a scale that staggered the imagination. The fleet that sailed in 1281 consisted of perhaps 4,000 ships carrying over 100,000 warriors, the largest amphibious assault in history up to that point. It was an armada that should have been unstoppable, a force that could have conquered not just Japan, but any maritime power in the world. The Japanese had used those 7 years to prepare defenses, stone walls along beaches where invasions might land, fortifications at strategic points, and above all, a determination to resist with every resource they possessed. When the Mongol fleet arrived, they found landing difficult and costly. Japanese defenders fought with suicidal bravery, launching night raids against Mongol ships, harassing landing parties, refusing to break even when facing overwhelming force. For weeks, the massive invasion fleet remained off the Japanese coast, unable to establish secure beachheads, consuming supplies at an unsustainable rate. Then in August, a typhoon struck with apocalyptic fury. For 2 days, winds of incredible power tore through the Mongol fleet, smashing ships against rocks, driving them into each other, drowning thousands of warriors who had survived battlefields from China to Hungary. When the storm finally passed, perhaps half the invasion force was dead or scattered. The Japanese called these storms kamikaze, divine winds, sent by the gods to protect Japan from foreign conquest. Whether divine intervention or simply the meteorological reality of typhoon season, the result was clear. The Mongol Empire had reached its limits. There were territories it could not conquer, enemies it could not defeat, natural barriers that even the greatest military machine in history could not overcome. The age of unstoppable expansion was ending. In the wake of conquest came something unexpected: peace. Not the peace of harmony and goodwill, but the peace of exhaustion, of territories so thoroughly subjugated that resistance became unthinkable. Across the vast expanse from the Pacific to the Black Sea, a single authority now governed, and with that unity came opportunities that had not existed for centuries. Historians would later call this period the Pax Mongolica, the Mongol Peace, and it would facilitate exchanges that reshaped the medieval world. The Silk Road, that ancient network of trade routes connecting East and West, had always existed in fragments, dangerous passages through territories controlled by hostile powers, where merchants risked robbery, taxation, and death. Under Mongol rule, these routes became safer than they had been in living memory. A merchant could travel from Venice to Beijing with reasonable confidence that Mongol authorities would protect trade, knowing that commerce enriched the empire through taxation and tribute. The yam system, the postal network Ögedei had established, evolved into something far more sophisticated. Stations spaced at regular intervals provided not just fresh horses, but accommodations, supplies, and security. Merchants carrying Mongol passports, metal tablets inscribed with imperial authority, could requisition resources and demand protection from local officials. The speed at which information and people could move across Eurasia increased exponentially. European merchants were among the first to exploit these opportunities. The Polo family of Venice, Niccolo, Maffeo, and young Marco made their famous journey to Kublai Khan's court, spending years in China and returning with tales that seemed almost fantastical to Europeans who had never imagined such wealth and sophistication existed. Marco Polo's account, whether entirely accurate or embellished, introduced Europe to a world beyond their limited geographical imagination. But trade was more than luxury goods and exotic stories. Technologies began to flow along these routes with unprecedented speed. Gunpowder, developed in China, moved westward, and within decades European armies were experimenting with cannons and firearms. The compass, paper-making techniques, and printing technology all traveled from east to west along routes secured by Mongol power. The acceleration of technological exchange during this period would have profound consequences for world history. Religious and intellectual exchanges followed commercial ones. Nestorian Christian missionaries traveled to China, Buddhist monks journeyed to Persia, and Islamic scholars found themselves in Mongol courts discussing philosophy with Confucian bureaucrats. Kublai Khan's court became a center of religious debate, where the great Khan invited representatives of different faiths to present their cases. The religious tolerance that had characterized Mongol rule from Genghis Khan's time created spaces for dialogue, unimaginable in more religiously homogeneous societies. Yet this interconnection came with costs that no one anticipated. Trade routes that carried silk and spices also carried disease. Rats hosting infected fleas traveled in grain shipments moving west from China. The bubonic plague, which had existed in isolated pockets in Central Asia, found in the Mongol trade networks a highway to spread across the entire known world. In the 1330s and 1340s, the Black Death began its terrible journey westward. The plague struck the Mongol heartlands first, killing princes and warriors with the same indifference it showed to merchants and peasants. As it spread westward along trade routes, it devastated cities from Samarkand to Constantinople. When it reached Europe in 1347, it would kill perhaps one-third of the continent's population. The Pax Mongolica, which had created unprecedented connectivity, also created conditions for unprecedented catastrophe. The irony was bitter. The very system that had enriched the Mongol Empire and facilitated cultural exchange also carried the seeds of its destruction. As plague ravaged populations, trade collapsed. The economic foundations of Mongol rule, which depended on taxation of commercial activity, began to erode. Cities that had thrived as trading centers became ghost towns. The magnificent interconnected world the Mongols had created was consuming itself from within. Yet even as plague devastated the empire, the exchanges it had facilitated could not be undone. Europeans had tasted Chinese silk and Indian spices and wanted more. They had learned of lands beyond their horizons and dreamed of reaching them. The geographical knowledge gained during the Pax Mongolica would inspire the age of exploration, as European sailors sought sea routes to Asia to bypass the now disrupted land routes. The Mongol Empire had connected the world, and even its collapse could not sever all those connections. When Kublai Khan died in 1294, he left behind an empire that existed more in theory than reality. The vast territories Genghis Khan had conquered remained under Mongol rule, but they were increasingly governed as separate states with their own interests, their own conflicts, and their own trajectories. The fiction of a unified Mongol Empire persisted, but the reality was fragmentation into four major khanates that would develop in radically different directions. The Yuan dynasty in China, which Kublai had founded, struggled with fundamental contradictions. The Mongols remained a tiny minority ruling over a vast Chinese population that had never truly accepted foreign rule. Kublai's successors lacked his political skill and his understanding of Chinese culture. They relied increasingly on a small circle of Mongol and Central Asian advisors, alienating the Chinese bureaucratic class that actually administered the empire. Inflation spiraled out of control as successive Khans debased the currency to fund lavish courts and military campaigns. Chinese resistance, suppressed during Kublai's reign, began to resurface in the form of secret societies and regional rebellions. The Red Turban Rebellion, which began in the 1350s, drew on both economic grievances and ethnic resentment of Mongol rule. What started as scattered uprisings gradually coalesced into organized movements led by charismatic figures who promised to restore Chinese rule. Among these rebels was a former Buddhist monk named Zhu Yuanzhang, who would prove to be the Yuan dynasty's nemesis. The Ilkhanate in Persia faced different challenges. Hulagu's descendants ruled over sophisticated Islamic civilizations with ancient administrative traditions. Initially, the Ilkhans remained shamanist or Buddhist, maintaining Mongol religious traditions even while governing Muslim populations. But the logic of ruling an Islamic society gradually asserted itself. In 1295, Ilkhan Ghazan converted to Islam, and with him, much of the Mongol elite in Persia followed. This conversion was both pragmatic and profound. It legitimized Mongol rule in the eyes of their subjects, but it also meant the Mongols were being absorbed into the civilization they had conquered. Within 2 generations, the Mongol elite in Persia spoke Persian, patronized Islamic art and architecture, and married into local aristocratic families. The conquerors were becoming the conquered, not through military defeat, but through cultural assimilation. The Chagatai Khanate in Central Asia remained the most traditionally Mongol of the successor states, maintaining nomadic lifestyles and steppe military traditions. But it was also the poorest and most fractious, lacking the agricultural wealth of China or the trade riches of Persia. Internal conflicts between princes fragmented it further, with eastern and western portions often at war with each other. It became a backwater of the Mongol world, important primarily as a reminder of what Mongol culture had been before conquest, and empire changed everything. The Golden Horde in Russia and Eastern Europe developed yet another model. The Mongols there maintained their distinct identity while extracting tribute from Russian principalities that remained nominally independent. Russian princes paid homage to the Khan, received patents of authority from him, and competed for his favor. This system of indirect rule preserved Russian culture and institutions while ensuring Mongol dominance and wealth extraction. It was exploitation without the burden of direct administration. Religious evolution across the Khanates revealed the diversity of Mongol adaptation. In China, some Mongols embraced Buddhism while others maintained shamanistic practices. In Persia, Islam became the dominant faith. The Golden Horde gradually converted to Islam in the early 14th century, while the Chagatai Khanate remained divided between Muslim and non-Muslim factions. The religious tolerance that Genghis Khan had mandated was giving way to the pressures of ruling populations with strong faith traditions. Trade between the Khanates continued, but increasingly they viewed each other as rivals rather than parts of a unified empire. Wars broke out between the Ilkhanate and the Golden Horde over control of the Caucasus. The Yuan dynasty and the Chagatai Khanate clashed over Central Asian territories. The dream of universal empire under a single great Khan was dead, replaced by competing regional powers that happened to share Mongol ancestry. By the 1350s, all 4 Khanates were in crisis. The Yuan dynasty faced massive rebellions in China. The Ilkhanate had collapsed into competing successor states. The Chagatai Khanate was fragmenting. Even the Golden Horde, most stable of the 4, was beginning to experience succession struggles that would eventually tear it apart. The Mongol Empire that had once seemed capable of conquering the entire world was dissolving. not through external defeat but through internal contradictions and the inexorable forces of cultural assimilation and political fragmentation. In 1368, Zhu Yuanzhang's rebel forces entered Dadu, the great capital Kublai Khan had built. The last Yuan emperor fled north to Mongolia with what remained of his court, leaving behind the palaces and treasures that had symbolized Mongol power in China. The Ming dynasty was proclaimed, and Chinese rule was restored after nearly a century of foreign domination. It was the beginning of the end for Mongol imperial power, but it was far from the end of Mongol influence on world history. The demographic impact of the Mongol conquest staggers comprehension even centuries later. Estimates suggest that 40 million people died during the initial waves of conquest, approximately 11% of the world's population at the time. Entire cities were erased, ancient irrigation systems destroyed, agricultural regions depopulated. Iran and Iraq, which had been among the most prosperous regions in the world before the Mongol invasions, saw their populations decline by perhaps 90% and would not fully recover for centuries. Yet the genetic legacy tells a more complex story. A 2003 genetic study revealed that approximately 16 million men alive today carry Y chromosome markers, suggesting they descend from Genghis Khan or his close male relatives. This represents roughly 1 in 200 men on Earth, a genetic footprint that speaks to both conquest and the systematic practice of powerful Mongol men having many children across vast territories. The empire lives on literally in the DNA of millions who have no idea they carry this heritage. The political legacy proved equally enduring. The Russian principalities that paid tribute to the Golden Horde developed forms of autocracy partly modeled on Mongol governance, centralized power, absolute rulers, elaborate court rituals. Ivan the Terrible and later Russian czars would employ tactics of terror and expansion that echoed Mongol methods. Russia's territorial expansion across Siberia in later centuries followed routes the Mongols had first mapped. In Central Asia, the memory of Genghis Khan became a source of legitimacy for later conquerors. Timur, known to Europeans as Tamerlane, claimed descent from Genghis and consciously modeled his campaigns on Mongol precedents, creating in the late 14th century an empire that briefly rivaled the Mongols in scope and brutality. His descendant Babur would found the Mongol Empire in India, the very name Mughal being a Persian pronunciation of Mongol, and an empire that would rule most of the subcontinent for centuries. The collapse of Mongol power also had consequences that shaped the modern world in unexpected ways. The disruption of overland trade routes forced Europeans to seek sea routes to Asia, spurring the age of exploration. Columbus sailed west seeking China and India because the Mongol collapse had made land routes too dangerous and fragmented. In this indirect way, the Mongol Empire's dissolution contributed to European colonial expansion and the eventual European domination of the Americas, the cultural exchanges. The Pax Mongolica facilitated left-lasting marks on civilizations across Eurasia. Chinese painting techniques influenced Persian miniature art. Islamic astronomical knowledge reached China. European metallurgy improved through exposure to Asian techniques. These exchanges occurred over decades and became so thoroughly integrated into local cultures that their Mongol-era origins were often forgotten. The military innovations the Mongols pioneered combined arms tactics, sophisticated logistics, extensive intelligence networks. Promotion by merit became standard practice in armies across Eurasia. European military theorists studied Mongol campaigns, and concepts like the feigned retreat entered the tactical vocabulary of medieval and early modern warfare. The Mongol synthesis of mobility and siege warfare influenced military thinking for centuries. Yet perhaps the most profound legacy is psychological and symbolic. The Mongol conquests demonstrated that no civilization no matter how ancient or sophisticated, was safe from sudden, catastrophic overthrow. The memory of Mongol invasion haunted European consciousness for generations, appearing in chronicles, art, and political discourse as the ultimate example of barbarism threatening civilization. In the Islamic world, the fall of Baghdad remained a trauma that shaped religious and political thinking, a reminder of vulnerability and loss. In Mongolia itself, Genghis Khan evolved from historical figure to national symbol and almost religious icon. Modern Mongolia, a small nation overshadowed by giant neighbors, found in Genghis Khan's legacy a source of pride and identity. Statues, currency, and national holidays commemorate the man who transformed scattered tribes into world conquerors. The complexities and horrors of that conquest are often simplified into a narrative of national greatness. The scholarly debate over how to assess the Mongol Empire continues. Was it primarily a destructive force that set back human civilization by centuries, particularly in the Islamic world? Or was it a catalyst that accelerated exchange between civilizations, spreading technologies and ideas that would eventually contribute to global modernity? The truth, as always, is more complex than either extreme. What remains beyond debate is that the Mongol Empire represented one of history's pivotal moments, a relatively brief period when the world became interconnected in ways that would have seemed impossible before and that could never be completely undone after. Genghis Khan and his descendants created an empire that lasted barely 2 centuries as a unified entity, but its shadow stretches across 800 years to touch the present day. In genes, in borders, in technologies, in cultural exchanges, and in collective memory, the Mongols remain with us still, conquerors whose empire fell but whose influence endures.